Hello friends, my name is Lana, and if you are a returning viewer, then thank you for coming back, or if you are new here, then welcome. Here we love to talk about aliens, true crimes, mysteries, conspiracies, and whatever else. Basically, if it's weird, unexplained, or just generally interesting, I want to talk about it. Helen Keller was born on June 27th, 1880 in a small town of Tuscumbia in Alabama. I hate saying the word Alabama because you can't change that to Australian. Like ass is ass and grass is grass, but you can't say Alabama. It's just not right. So I hate saying Alabama. I don't know, it's a hard word for me to say, Alabama. Anyway, Helen's life started off just like any other child. She was alert, she was healthy, and she had already started saying a few words by the time that she was 1. So her parents, Arthur and Kate Keller, had no reason but to expect anything but a normal life for her. But at just 19 months old, she was struck by a sudden illness. Nowadays, doctors think that it was either scarlet fever or meningitis, but no one's really sure. What is certain though is that the illness left Helen both blind and deaf. At first, her family didn't fully grasp the extent of what had happened. They noticed that she wasn't reacting to sounds and she wasn't following things with her eyes anymore, but it took time for the full reality to sink in. Once it did, it was heartbreaking for them to see their daughter trapped in total isolation. And as Helen got older, the frustration only grew because she had no way to express her needs or her wants. Her behavior became wild and unpredictable. She would scream, yell, she would bite people, kick people, she would throw tantrums. And can you really blame her? I know it's troublesome, but imagine being trapped in your own body, unaware of what's going on, and you can't communicate with people in any meaningful way. Her family did try and help as best as they could, but they had no training or resources. But her mother, Kate, was really determined to find answers and find help for Helen. She read everything that she could about people with similar disabilities, and that's when she came across the work of none other than Dr. Alexander Graham Bell, the guy who invented the telephone. And he was also involved in education for the deaf, so he suggested that the Kellers contact the Perkins School for the Blind, and they were in Boston. And this was a suggestion that would change Helen's life forever, because when she was 6, Perkins School would send a 20-year-old teacher by the name of Anne Sullivan to work with her. And let me just say, if Helen's story is incredible, Anne's is just as remarkable. Anne Sullivan was born in Massachusetts in 1866 to poor Irish immigrant parents. That was hard to get out. She had a rough childhood, and by the age of 5, she began to lose her vision due to a disease called trachoma. After her mother died, her father abandoned the family, and she was sent with her brother to a poorhouse. And her brother tragically didn't survive very long there. But Anne pushed through, and eventually she was sent to Perkins School for the Blind, where she would receive an education. She underwent several surgeries that helped to improve her eyesight, and she developed fierce independence. So when she was just 20 years old, she arrived at the Kellers' house in Tuscumbia, Alabama, in March 1887. And at first their relationship was rocky because while her parents loved Helen, they would always give in to her outbursts, mainly just to avoid conflict. But because of this, Helen ruled the house and Anne just would not have it. From day one, she insisted on structure and discipline, but not out of cruelty, but because she believed that Helen had the ability to learn and that she deserved more than pity. So Anne moved into a small cottage on the property with Helen where they would work one-on-one away from the enabling habits from the main house. Anne didn't arrive with a magic fix. She just came with a deep patience and a belief that Helen could learn. She began signing words into Helen's palm, hoping that eventually she would connect the dots that these words had meaning. And at first, Helen just mimicked the motions because she didn't understand that these were actual words. But still, Anne kept going. And then came the moment, the breakthrough. One day in early April, Anne took Helen to the water pump outside. She held one of Helen's hands under the flowing water, and with her other hand, she spelt W-A-T-E-R into Helen's palm. This is something that she had done countless times before, but this time something in Helen just clicked. Helen suddenly paused because she finally understood that the feeling of the cool liquid running over her hand and the strange things that Anne was doing in her palm, those two were connected. It was her first moment of true language comprehension, and in Helen's own words, she said that this was the moment that her soul awakened. And from that moment, Helen could not get enough. She said that her brain went into overdrive. She started learning words at lightning speed. She learnt 30 in the next day and over 600 in just a matter of months. She understood that everything had a name, and by naming things, she had power and a sense of control over her own life that she had never had before. And Anne didn't stop with words. She taught Helen how to read Braille, how to write using both regular and Braille typewriters, and even how to listen by placing her thumb on the speaker's throat, her finger on the lip, and her other finger on the nose. So that way she could feel the vibrations of the words. And that's how she would learn to listen.
She had observed that we did not use the hands when we were talking to each other. And I let her see, by putting her hand on my face, how we talked with our mouths. She felt the vibration of the spoken word. Instantly she spelled, "I want to talk with my mouth." That seemed impossible. But after experimenting for a time, we found that placing her hand in this position, the thumb resting on the throat, right at the larynx, the first finger on the lips, the second on the nose, we found that she could feel the vibration of spoken words. For instance, the throat, she feels the G, the hard G, the. And on the lips, she feels and the K sound. On the lips, she feels the B, with the second finger on the nose, the nasal sounds, the 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 first word she learned to articulate was the little word "it." With the hand in this position, I made the vowel "I." She felt it. "I." Then I made the T. She feels it with the finger on her lips, on my lips. Then I put the two letters together to form the word "it," and the first word was learned. After her 7th lesson, she was able to speak the sentence word by word, I am not dumb now.
No. It's easy to focus on Helen's achievements because they are so incredible, but without Anne, they wouldn't have really been possible. And Anne became not only her teacher, but one of her closest friends, and for decades they were inseparable. And with Anne by her side, her journey into the world of education began. And what she accomplished over the next few years is nothing short of extraordinary. Her first major step is when Helen enrolled at the Perkins Institute for the Blind. And remember, this is the same place where Anne had been a student. She later attended the Wright Humason School for the Deaf in New York City, where she would later begin to learn to speak. Even though she was deaf and blind, Helen was determined to be able to vocalize her thoughts. And like I said, she studied lip reading by feeling the vibrations on people's throats and lips, and that's a process that took friggin' years of patience. In the year 1900, Helen was admitted to Radcliffe College, which is a women's branch of Harvard University. She couldn't hear her lectures, so she had to have textbooks transcribed into Braille, and she would take her exams by Anne spelling the words into her hand. There were no accessibility services back then. They didn't have digital tools. There were no accommodations like what we have now. But despite that, she absolutely frickin' crushed it. And in 1904, Helen Keller became the first deaf-blind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. She not only mastered the core subjects, but she also taught herself multiple languages. She taught herself French, German, Latin, Greek. So while most people are struggling to learn one foreign language in school, she taught herself many of them without being able to hear a single word of it. I mean, I did Italian in school for like 10 years and all I can do is count from 1 to 100. That's really not great on me. But hey, I never used to want to pay attention, but now I love to learn, which is why we're doing this, right? Yeah. Anyhow, her academic journey wasn't just about grades and degrees. It was a powerful statement that disability does not mean inability, and that given the right support, both physical and social barriers can be broken down. She went to use her voice however she could to help others, and her education gave her that voice. It gave her access to the broader world, and more importantly, it gave her the tools to fight for change. The road was long and exhausting and isolating, and Helen once said that college is not the place to go for ideas. She found the academic system really rigid and really frustrating, especially when she had to fight so hard to access the same information as her peers. But in the end, she made it. One page, one word, one hand-spelled sentence at a time. And as incredible as this chapter of her life was, it was only one part of her story. After graduating, Helen didn't retreat into a quieter life. Instead, she stepped out onto the world stage and she was using her voice loud and clear. At just 22 years old, she published her first and probably most famous book named The Story of My Life. It gave the world an insight into what it was like to be born deaf and blind, or not born, but raised deaf and blind. And more importantly, it showed the world that she wasn't trapped in silence. She had thoughts, she had a dream, and she had a voice, and she wanted to use it. Helen kept on writing, and she gave us the book called The World I Live In. And this was how she described how she experienced reality through her other senses, like taste and touch and smell, and using her imagination. Like, can you even imagine trying to describe colors or a landscape or music when you can't even see or hear them? Well, somehow she pulled it off. And then she released the book Out of the Dark, which goes more into her social and political beliefs. She wrote about socialism, workers' rights and women's rights, and surprise, surprise, that didn't really go well with the conservative publishers. They weren't rejecting her because she was deaf-blind, although I'm sure that there was a lot of ableism going on back then. They were also really uncomfortable about how outspoken she was about politics. Another one of her books, Midstream, picks up where her earlier story left off, and it dives into her adult life. It really shows how much she grew, not just in her personal independence, but also as a public speaker. Yeah, she didn't just write, she became a prolific public speaker.
Helen's artificially acquired monotone is interpreted by Miss Thompson for those children who have partial or aided hearing.
It makes me proud to see how precisely you will overcome obstacles.
It makes me proud to see how you're overcoming difficulties.
I know every step and road you are traveling.
I know every step of the road you are taking.
And I rejoice at you cheer and determination.
And I rejoice at your cheer and determination.
The obstacles you meet are many.
Because the obstacles you meet are many. Hold fast to the ideal your teachers are planting in your heart.
And when you go out with life strangely and adventures.
And when you go out to life's struggles and adventures,
you will raise a banner.
You will raise a banner
who follow you.
For the deaf who follow you. Yes.
I'm not really actually that afraid of public speaking. Anyway, and keep in mind that speaking was kind of hard for her because her speech was affected by her disability, and not a lot of people could understand her clearly, but that didn't stop her. But she kept at it. She was determined that her words mattered, even if it took people a little bit extra time to understand. Anne Sullivan and later Polly Thompson would translate or clarify for her during her talks. But Helen herself, she stood there commanding attention, and she was making her point. And people listened, and not out of pity, but because they were genuinely interested in what she had to say. she would write these beautifully crafted sentences and then she would stand on the stage and deliver them with conviction. Of course, in the beginning, not everyone was wanting to give her a platform. Publishers rejected her, critics doubted her. Society basically wanted to keep her this inspirational little side note in history. Like, oh, look at this little girl who learned to sign. Isn't that sweet? But Helen wasn't here for that, and she refused to be a footnote in history. So she kept on writing, she kept on speaking, and she kept on making people feel uncomfortable. Every book she wrote, every lecture she gave was a huge middle finger or a big FU to the people who thought that disability meant inability or invisibility. She wasn't silent, she wasn't hidden away. She was out there shaping conversations and challenging assumptions, and she was leaving behind a body of work that speaks louder than us with eyes and functioning eyes and ears. Now, rewinding a little bit, when Helen Keller was 11 years old, she wrote a book called The Frost King, and excited, she sent this book to the director of the Perkins Institute for the Blind. And this story was published in the school's newsletter, and people were impressed with her because this was coming from a deaf-blind kid who had just learnt language. But then drama. It turned out that Helen's story was strikingly similar to that of The Frost Fairies by Margaret Canby. And the similarities were so close that people started questioning if Helen had written this at all. Teachers and administrators at the Perkins Institute for the Blind essentially put Helen on trial. They gathered in a room, they grilled her on the story, and they tried to figure out whether or not she had copied the idea from Margaret. Keep in mind, she's 11 years old, she's deaf and blind, she's just learnt a language, and now she's being accused of fraud. Helen insisted that she had no memory of reading The Frost Fairies, but it was later discovered that Anne had in fact read the book to her by spelling it in her hand. Helen must have absorbed that story and forgotten that she had heard it, and then she had rewritten it as her own. Today we call that cryptomnesia, which is where you forget a memory and then you bring it on as a new idea of your own. But at that time, the adults didn't really have that idea. They just thought that plagiarism was plagiarism, period. But that whole ordeal, that devastated and humiliated Helen. She wrote later that she was really afraid to write again because she was worried that whatever she would write was actually not originally her idea. And Anne Sullivan was furious at how harshly they had treated Helen. She defended Helen by saying it was absurd to expect someone who was learning a language to always be able to distinguish between what she was taught versus what she had independently created. But the damage was done and Helen's confidence took a hit, and for a while she avoided doing any type of creative writing. Instead, she would focus on autobiographies, essays, and non-fiction where she would draw directly from her lived experiences. Helen later joined the Socialist Party of America and later the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, also known as the Wobblies. And the Wobblies were no joke. They were militant union organisers who wanted to shake up the entire system of capitalism. And let's not forget, she also founded the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. And that is the same organisation that still exists today, and it fights for free speech, civil rights, and liberties in the US. So yeah, Helen wasn't just playing around with ideas. She built an institution that has lasted for over a century. Now, of course, as always, that activism came with drama and controversy because the media absolutely loved Helen when she was the little girl who overcame her disability. But the second that she starts criticizing capitalism, suddenly she's naive. But that's the pattern that you'll see over and over again in Helen Keller's life. You know, as long as she fits the narrative that people liked, they loved her. But the moment that she starts challenging the system, now she's a nuisance. One of my favorite things about Helen, though, is that she didn't let them make her tone it down. She wasn't like, oh, they don't like me talking about politics, I'll just stay to being inspirational. She knew that the media would smear her or that critics would call her radical, but she would still say how she felt anyway. Helen would tour over 35 countries in her lifetime. She would spread awareness for people with disabilities, and she would advocate for better opportunities for people who are blind and deaf. And Helen was rolling with some of the most famous names in history. She met Winston Churchill, She met Charlie Chaplin and she met John F. Kennedy. And in 1964, she was presented the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And that's one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. That's basically America saying, okay, you changed the world. We see you. We see you, Queen. In her 30s, Helen fell in love with a man named Peter Fagan. He was a young reporter who worked as her secretary for a while, and they grew really close. It wasn't just some passing crush, they actually planned to get married. Helen wanted what most people want. She wanted companionship and intimacy and the ability to live life on her own terms, but her family said no. They shut it down. They're like, nope, this isn't happening. You know, maybe they didn't believe that she could handle marriage, or maybe they believed that Peter wasn't genuine. But either way, the relationship ended and Helen was never married. And that wasn't her only source of frustration, because fame is a double-edged sword and she felt it. She struggled with isolation and dependency too, because as much as she achieved, she still had to rely heavily on others. Her relationship with Anne Sullivan is another part of her humanity that gets oversimplified. Anne wasn't just her teacher, she was a lifeline for Helen. The two of them were incredibly close, but it wasn't always smooth sailing. They had fights, moments of codependence, and even exhaustion from being in each other's pockets all of the time. Anne sacrificed her own health and personal life to be by Helen's side, and sometimes Helen resented the dependency even as much as she loved her. Anne Sullivan's death in 1936 marked a turning point in Helen's life because she had never experienced such a deep loss before. Anne had been by Helen's side for nearly 50 years, guiding her through every triumph and every challenge. So when Anne passed away at the age of 70 due to, her tuberculosis and other illnesses, Helen was devastated. She later described Anne's death as if the sun itself had just gone out of her life. But after Anne's death, she didn't retreat from the world. Instead, she leaned more into Polly Thompson. And Polly was another loyal assistant who had worked for years with Anne and Helen. The two of them continued to travel. They continued to, do lecturers and fight for rights. It wasn't easy, but Helen kept moving forward and she kept Anne's memory alive while doing it. Fast forward a few decades and Helen had lived an incredibly long life herself. She lived far longer than many doctors thought that she would when she was a child. She died in 1968, just a few weeks before her 88th birthday. She passed away peacefully in her sleep at her home in Connecticut after a life where most people, even sighted or without disabilities, they couldn't even imagine fitting all of that into one lifetime. She had met presidents and kings and activists, and she had toured the world. She'd written books and she had touched millions of lives. But in modern times, Helen Keller has become part of a debate in something called inspiration porn. And if you haven't heard that term before, that's when disabled people are reduced to feel-good stories, like the term, if they can do it, what's your excuse? And some critics argue that Helen's story had been packaged and repackaged in that way, and it stripped away the real complexity of her life and activism. So after everything we've covered, what is the big takeaway from Helen's story? Well, first of all, Helen Keller's life is proof that your limitations do not define you. Deaf and blind people in the 1800s, people thought that she would never learn, that she would never work, and that she'd never be able to contribute, but she proved them wrong. And second is the power of education, which is what we're doing here. If there's one consistent theme in Helen Keller's life, is that education and learning opened up so many doors for her. Education gave Helen the tools to express herself and connect with the world and advocate for others. It gives people power, no matter their background, who they are, what they believe in, or their circumstances. And finally, the importance in equality. Helen Keller's activism made it clear that she wasn't just fighting for people with disabilities. Yes, she spoke for the blind and the deaf, but she spoke for women and people living in poverty. She believed that the world moves forward only when everyone has a chance to thrive equally. She once said that alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. Helen Keller knew that real change doesn't come from one person's triumph. It comes from communities pushing together for a more equal world. I've always found Helen Keller to be really inspirational. You know, I don't think of her every day, but she does pop into my mind here and there. I guess that's why I want to do a story on her so close to my channel starting, because she is so amazing and she's so inspirational and people need to know about her. So yeah, thank you for watching today's video. If you enjoyed it, I would recommend watching some other ones of mine. I'll link them in the description down below. And let me know what you think about Helen Keller. Did you already know who she was? Have you learnt anything today? Let me know what you think. Leave me a comment. Next video is back onto our conspiracies. I've got a couple, 2 or 3 lined up, so keep an eye out for those. They're really interesting. They're probably my favorite ones. We'll see. But yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for clicking on this video and staying here for this long. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.